All right, welcome back to part 4. In part 4, we're going to think about, with all of the information that we've collected and the way we've defined our problem, we're going to think about how do we now link it up with the strategies that we've been talking about to intensify our plan to improve outcomes. So we've talked about how do we measure fidelity, how do we measure whether the kids are responding. We've talked about how we develop precision problem statements to really refine what it is that we're working on. And now we're going to move into section 4, where we think about how do we develop an action plan to intensify our implementation and support improvement in either fidelity of implementation or student outcomes. So how do we develop an action plan? We think about, in our flow chart here, we just simply said something as simple as review, adjust, and intensify your implementation. But how do we do this? Let's break it down a little bit. First, an action plan is really just a glorified to-do list. It really just lists the things that need to be done, who's going to do them, what kind of supports does that person need, and when are they going to be done by. So it's really a pretty simple thing, but it's a really important tool for sort of helping follow through on the things that you need to support your implementation or to support student improvement. So whenever you develop a plan to intensify your implementation or support for kids, it's important to document that in an action plan. There are a number of different examples that are available in the table on page 11 in that data guide that you can look at that will help you develop an action plan that works for you. It's not important that you pick a particular template or a particular format. It's important that you pick one that works for you. Think about just a way to document what you're trying to do and what supports you might need to do it to help hold yourself accountable and help make sure that things are actually happening the way you want them to. All right, when we're defining our goals, we want to really think about defining that problem with precision. Thinking about how we measure the problem, what's the level or the amount of the problem behavior that's happening, and then think about what would we consider good and being as realistic but challenging as possible. We want to set a high bar, but make sure it's one that our students can reach. So what would we consider improvement? And then set the goal around that. And then use your goal to help guide the solution. How do we move from where we are to where we want to be? And so we're going to think about that by putting things in this chart here. You've got a general problem. Students are off task during small group instruction. We use our precision statement that we've just worked on developing. So we really dive into exactly what's going on there. It's 3 to 4 students. They're off task at the end of the lesson while the teacher's working with somebody else. And currently, the teacher reminds them to follow along when they're off task. Then we're going to set a goal and say what we think would be an appropriate improvement is that 5 or 6 students stay on task when the teacher needs to work with that one student. So we're going to move from 3 to 4 students off task to 5 to 6 students that are able to stay on task. And that will be what we are shooting for when we're putting together this intervention plan. So we're now going to stop and ask you to think a little bit about what this looks like in your classroom. So use the precision problem statement that you just developed and develop a goal to go along with it. So you've got a general problem, a precision problem statement, and you're going to add on your goal. And remember to keep your goal as observable and measurable as possible. Make sure you know for sure when you've reached it. Welcome back from that activity. Just double check one more time that your goal is written in observable and measurable ways so that when somebody else looks at your goal or when you revisit your goal a week from now, you know for sure whether or not you've met it. Making sure your goal is high but also achievable. So we're not going to look for complete perfection from anybody, but we want to push kids to be as on task and appropriate and engaged in their learning as possible. Next, we're going to think about using this data to develop solutions. And there's a number of different components that we're going to think about when we develop our solutions. And you'll see these all put together in a minute. But we want to think a little bit about these one at a time. So we're going to start by thinking about prevention. And you've heard this from the very beginning of this course, that really our most important part of our behavioral intervention plan is on the antecedent side, thinking about how do we prevent problem behaviors from happening in the first place. Are there schedule changes we can make? Is there a change to the curriculum, the way we present our academic content? Thinking back to those antecedent strategies that we talked about in Module 3. Next, we're going to think about what do we need to teach? What are the things that the students need to know how to do instead? How do we define and teach and monitor those expectations? Teaching the appropriate behavior And then teaching the kids that what they're currently engaging in is not appropriate behavior. Let them know that that is inappropriate behavior and let them know what they need to do instead. So go back to those teaching strategies that we talked about also in Module 3. After we've talked about prevention and teaching, we're going to next think about recognition or extinction and extinction. So what are the ways that we can systematically reward or reinforce the behavior we want to see more of? So we've got to identify what we want to see more of. In this case, we want to see more on-task behavior. How do I recognize that and systematically reinforce that in my classroom? I also need to think a little bit about whether or not I've been previously reinforcing the inappropriate behavior. Am I calling on kids when they are off task? Am I giving them attention for things that I maybe shouldn't be giving them attention for, that maybe I'm inadvertently reinforcing something? And if so, then I need to make sure I put that particular behavior on extinction and I no longer provide reinforcement for that. That sounds new to you, or you still have some questions about that, go back and see those reinforcement strategies that we talked about in Module 4. And then after we've thought through all of those things, then we're going to think about how we can systematically correct those problem behaviors. What are the consequence or punishment strategies that we can apply in this situation to make sure that the problem behavior is not only not being reinforced, but is actually being corrected. So thinking back to Module 5 for those punishment strategies that we talked about. And then after all of that's in place, whenever we put a plan in place, we need to make sure that we're monitoring the extent to which we've put that plan in place with fidelity. Are we doing what we said we were going to be doing? And if so, is it leading to the outcomes that we hope to see? And of course, if it is great, we're going to celebrate and continue to monitor. And if it's not, we need to go back and revise our plan or intensify particular strategies and use data to do that. And that's really been the content that we've talked about last module and this module. So we're going to put all of these different components together in a solution plan. So if we think about developing an example, we're going to start with the prevention side of things. How can we prevent this problem behavior from happening in the first place? Maybe you plan some individual support for the beginning of the lesson. Provide a specific task for the other students to be working on while you're working one-on-one with that particular student. And right before you pull that student aside, you might think about prompting the rest of the students and remind them what they need to be doing during that time. You might need to think about reteaching classroom expectations or reminding or teaching the kids how to get help if they need help while you're working with somebody else in the classroom. Reteaching those particular expectations will help prevent the problem behavior from happening in the first place. What are the ways that you can recognize the appropriate behavior? You're going to target on-task behavior with your class-wide reinforcement system. Notice when kids are doing a good job staying on task, even when you're not able to be right there working with them. So you might use your class-wide token economy and just intensify the reinforcement for this particular behavior during this particular time of your lesson. If you've been previously reinforcing that behavior, you've got to make sure to put that on extinction and make sure that you're requiring students to go ahead and use that getting help routine or whatever that routine is in your classroom, and use planned ignoring so you don't accidentally provide teacher attention to a problem behavior. Make sure that if a kid is off task, you're correcting that quickly for them and redirecting them onto task. And then think about how are you going to monitor your use of this plan? How are you going to get it in place and double check that it's in place? You might use this plan as a checklist. After you've delivered that lesson, come back to this. Did I do the things I talked about for prevention? Check. Did I do the teaching components? Did I do the recognition components? You can use something as simple as this chart as your fidelity checklist for this behavior plan. And then you might consider using something like that DBR strategy we talked about in this module to monitor students' on-task behavior to see whether it's improving or not across time. So that's what it looks like when we put it all together into a solution example. We're now going to ask you to pause and think about how you can use this in your classroom. So go back to the content that we've talked about throughout this entire course. Just referred you back to specific modules. Use those 5 critical features of classroom management. Think about the data that you've collected in Module 6 and Module 7. Think about your goal and your current performance in your classroom, and start to develop a solution plan for your classroom. How can you prevent this problem behavior from happening? What do you need to teach? What do you need to reinforce? What do you need to correct? Remember to really emphasize the prevention and teaching components of this. So work on that in your workbook, and then we will come back together in a few minutes and review. Welcome back from that activity. Remember, if you are struggling with what to put in a particular box of this activity, if you're working through your solution table and you're not sure what goes in a box, think about going back to review the content in modules 1 through 5 where we talked about those specific strategies, and see if you can come up with some additional examples for what could go in those boxes to help you put together a plan that makes sense for your specific problem behaviors in your classroom, and put together a solution plan that includes all of those different components.